Okay, are we ready? So, welcome back to Journalism and Media Week with myself, Lee Purvis. And it gives me great joy to introduce our next guest. He's had a very long day and is quite possibly one of the most hardest ever working broadcasters of our time. Please give a very warm welcome. It's Jeremy Vine. Jeremy, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
I haven't even done anything yet.
I know, but you're here, that's the main thing, even though obviously you're down south, we're up north. Welcome to Leeds Trinity University. So, we've got a lot to get through. You've had a really long day. How's your day been?
It's fine. You know, at about 2 o'clock, I feel my just personal screensaver come on. So I've had some strong coffee. It's weird. I get up at 4:40. And I cycle in to do ITN. I do a 2-hour show there, and then I come to Radio 2 to do a 2-hour show here. So yeah, that's 4 hours a day. That's 20 hours a week live. So yeah, I feel good. I mean, in the end, it's not work, is it? Let's be honest.
Oh, that's amazing. Well done you, and thanks again. And you're probably on your second or third coffee by now, I presume. So can you start back when you first started out working in journalism and put yourself at the heart of where our students are now? How did you come about working in journalism? Can you remember that first day of that first job?
Oh, totally. So I basically, I suppose if I have to really go back to the really first day, I was 12. And at the age of 12, I wrote a letter to Capital Radio in London, and they had a young DJ slot where you did 15 minutes on a Sunday, and I got in and I went and did this slot, and you know, I played some really bad records. I know that. I think I played James Galway and Elvis Presley, but it was 1977, and I just walked out and thought, I'm going to be on the radio. And it doesn't mean that I had any talent, but I just had an absolute sense of direction. And the first thing I did when I got home, age 12, was write to every single local radio station in Britain asking for a job. And I only got one reply. And I must have written 50 to 60 letters, all clacking on my parents' manual typewriter. And I can remember it. So I can even feel the typewriter keys on my fingers now, I tell you. And I was 12, so it's 45 years ago. And I've always thought it's not, honestly, it's not about talent or any of this. It's about a sense of what you want to do and where you want to go. And also conflicting with that, some flexibility when things are changing as they are. But then, so life goes on, and I left Durham University, and weirdly, and this will really amaze you, in the mid-80s, newspapers had so many jobs, they sort of begged you to join them. So I joined the Coventry Evening Telegraph as a trainee. I hadn't even been to Coventry before. And you asked me about my first day at work. My first day at work at Coventry, I was sent to the local railway station to interview some students who were dressed as bears, who were raising money for the local hospital called Waldegrave Hospital. And I was so keen, I got my notepad. I asked them every single question, what they were raising money for, which was the ward, why they were doing it. I think I even asked some of them what their height was. And when I got back, the editor said, why were they dressed as bears? And I said, I'm looking through my notepad, I don't know. So he sent me back to the railway station to ask them. And the funny thing was that they didn't know either. So I learned from that, always ask the question, why were they dressed as bears? I mean, that's pretty much my main journalism tip, to be honest.
We'll remember that. So the BBC, you started there, I think it was 1987. Was that when you started? Yeah. And obviously the BBC has recently celebrated being 100 years old. So you must have seen a lot of change during your time working at the BBC. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's just mind-boggling. Well, if we go back to Coventry, but where I was before the BBC when I was on this newspaper, let's start there. So my day in Coventry, I cycle in. I mean, that's the only thing that hasn't changed, actually. I cycle in, and there's 75 journalists in the Coventry Evening Telegraph newsroom. 75. And they sell 100,000 copies a day. And there are lots of national newspapers that don't sell that now. And they had you type out on this sort of manual typewriter, and then you put it on paper, and the paper goes across the room, and the guy walks. He forwards it using his legs. I mean, there was no computer. He puts it in a tube. It whooshes around the room. It goes and is typeset in hot metal, as they call it. And then as I walk towards my bike at the end of the day, I'm walking past the printing presses, and if I look hard enough, I can see my story. So obviously all of that's gone. They no longer have 75 people. They have 9, I think. And the big thing that's hit the BBC is digital. And the funny thing about digital is, when I was on the Coventry Evening Telegraph, they were starting to think about computers, and they thought computers would be brilliant because they could print more pages and they might be able to even print in colour. And the mistake they made was not realising that it would be the readers who got the computers, and the readers would take them elsewhere for news. And that's what we've seen across the whole media. And it's thrown us, really. I mean, I'm here at Radio 2. The only bit of the media that's almost as it was 30 years ago is this bit, that radio has survived. I don't know how it's done it. I just think maybe it wasn't big enough to kill off or something, but radio is booming, and it's a joyful place to be, I could tell you.
I couldn't agree more. And what do you think the future holds for the BBC? How do you think the BBC is going to evolve?
I mean, God, I've got no idea. I mean, I've got no idea. I wish I knew, you know. When I go back 30, so I joined in 87, right? And I was I was a trainee, but I was desperate to just start reporting. And what you find in the BBC is there's a division between the power and the glory. So people who want to be producers and run the place, they become director general and executives and all that boring stuff. And they go for the power. The presenters, journalists, go for the glory. So we want to be on the screen, on the radio, right? We can't understand why anybody would want to be a producer. We just assume that they've had a catastrophic failure in their career that no one can talk about. And so so when you ask a question about the future of the BBC, the presenter can't even compute with that. I mean, I would hear that as, what's your future, Jeremy? I mean, you can ask an executive what the future of the organisation is. So that division, the power and the glory, comes up again and again and again. And the reporter is, as soon as I joined it, I thought, oh my God, I've landed in this universe with 2 types of citizen. And they just said the BBC News trainee course that I was on, and it was a hard course to get into. I think they had 8 places and 8,000 applicants or whatever. God knows why they took me. But as soon as we arrived, they said, none of you are going to be reporters. There are too many reporters. Too many people want to show off. You've got to be producers, because there are loads of jobs for producers. And I just thought, well, stuff that. So I started trying to get some reporting work while I was a trainee. And I noticed when I was coming from Oxford Circus Tube down the road from here, I would go down Carnaby Street, and there was a store there that was selling, as I looked close, it was selling Nazi memorabilia, really sort of tasteless iron-on swastikas and, iron crosses and stuff, it was awful, So I said to the BBC Stores people, can I actually bring in a tape recorder and go and record this guy? So I went to the place and I started trying to do an interview, and the guy then tried to attack me. So the guy who ran the shop tried to come out with a piece of wood and hit me with it, and he swung it a couple of times, and I moved to one side, and he hit the tape recorder with the wood, which turned it off, which was really annoying. So when I did the piece on the air, you could just hear me saying, the shopkeeper has come out and he's trying to hit me, stop it. And that was my first appearance. It was very unceremonious. But what was interesting to me was that they were utterly uninterested in the attack on me, but they thought the attack on the tape recorder was an absolutely heinous act, and it became a really big thing. Someone had tried to attack a BBC tape recorder, and I suddenly realised I started to exist. So that was 1987, and I was a trainee, and then I just hustled. And I think for your students there, that's what you're going to have to do. I think it's really hard, but I ended up with a job on the Today programme, and I then began to travel and like I saw, some of the world at the age of 24, and I felt so lucky, and I felt lucky every day since. I've just had so much fun. So if it all ends tomorrow, it's been incredible, honestly, incredible.
So going forward to today, obviously you have your television show on 5 every morning and then your BBC Two radio programme in the afternoon, straddling across 2 different formats essentially. Obviously BBC more corporate, Channel 5 television more maverick. What is your favourite? Which do you prefer? Come on, tell us the truth.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. I was having lunch yesterday with the guy who is the editor of the boss of the boss's editor or whatever at Channel 5. So it's someone on an ITN. I don't really know what he does at all, but we were talking about what's the difference. And I don't know about corporate because Radio 2 is a bit crazy as well, but Radio 2 wouldn't do I'm a Celeb and Channel 5 would. Channel 5 wouldn't do the Iranian women who are protesting over the headscarf, and Radio 2 would. So there's a little bit of, you're right, the BBC is a little bit more serious actually, and Channel 5 is just mayhem, absolute mayhem from start to finish, and it's the best, it's the most fun. You have a show with your name on. I come in the morning, to answer your question, I always think that Channel 5 is like playing squash, and Radio 2 is like playing snooker. So TV is always a big bang. You can't understate it. It's like bang, the show's here and you're jumping out the screen. My hero is Peter Snow, who did that. Radio 2, you think about Wogan. Radio 2 is much more intimate. Radio is a conversation. With TV, you've got 1 million viewers. With Radio 2, you've got 1 listener. Somebody said to Terry Wogan, how many listeners have you got now, Terry? Is it 9 million or 10 million? He said, no, I've only ever had 1. And so, yeah, going across to media is a stretch. And I mean, I can tell you more about my Channel 5 morning if you want. I can tell you what I did today.
I watched. I know what you did today. I saw you leaping around the screen at one point, talking about climate change. I watched viewers phone in, very heated, about sausages, vegan sausages. Yeah, so we know, we watch. We're fans of yours, Jezza. We are. So moving on, because there's so much to get through with your glittering career to date. You've interviewed so many world leaders, haven't you? Tony Blair the other week, I heard you grilling Keir Starmer. Who has been the most memorable interviewee to date and why?
Well, I had a weird experience when I was in Africa. I was the Africa correspondent. And the funny thing about being in South Africa when I was there was that Nelson Mandela was the president. And he was obviously a massive global figure. He'd been in prison for 27 years, come out, and he just decided to do 1 term as president. That's it. And so I was there during this amazing term. And the funny thing about South Africa, it's got fewer people in than the UK. And actually, the political body in South Africa is really small. It's almost like, I don't want to do it down, but it's a bit like, a local council or something in some ways. It's quite a small number of people who do politics. So you ended up running into Mandela the whole time. It's just nuts. And often on stories that weren't going to do anything back home, but you just turn up. So the thing that I always remember, that always strikes me even now, was there'd been a promise by Mandela that he would get a standpipe, a water tap, to within 100 yards of every front door. So it was not possible to get running water into every property for various reasons. Townships are quite disordered places in many ways. But he'd fulfilled this promise. The last standpipe went into a street in Soweto, actually, fun enough, which is Soweto because it's called Southwest Township in Johannesburg, which is obviously where he'd lived and a lot of political action had happened. So he was going down there to talk about this tap. And you'd assume, wouldn't you, that there'd be hundreds of people. But actually, there are not that many foreign correspondents. There were quite a lot of South African reporters who didn't turn up. So there was only 6 of us. And the 6 of us stood there, and I thought, you know what, this isn't going to make the news, and it didn't, not in Britain. But I thought, what a privilege is this? I'm standing 6 foot from Mandela. He's going to talk about this tap, and I'm going to ask him about the tap. We then had a selfie, but I took a photo of him with a producer, and I missed out on my photo with Mandela. But I thought, this is really interesting lesson for me, that even if you're a great icon like Mandela, you've still got to deliver that last tap to within 100 yards of everyone's front door. So it was a great lesson for me that in the end, politics is all about the tap. It's not necessarily about being a global megastar. So yeah, I've interviewed lots of politicians, but remember that politics is in this country, very straight. Not a lot happens that is surprising or interesting. If I say to you, can you remember any interview with any American president ever? prior to Trump, you won't be able to, except for maybe Nixon Frost in the 80s, 70s. So it's a stretch to get something that is lively out of a politician, because for them, every answered question is a loss of power. But in terms of the joy of going out with a recorder and interviewing people, there's nothing like it. All presenters struggle with the idea they're locked in a studio. We all feel like we're in a hostage situation. So again, in South Africa, I was in a place called Umtata, and there was some idea that Nelson Mandela would be campaigning and his wife was in the same place, Winnie Mandela, and they were divorced, and maybe something would happen. And it obviously wasn't going to, but I went anyway. And I ended up in the back of Beyond in this little village called Kwak, great place. And there was a village chief hoeing his vegetables. And I said, are you offended because you've been told that Winnie Mandela is going to be here and she's not here? And he said, I cannot be offended because nothing has happened. And I thought, that's a moment of cosmic brilliance from a man who maybe hasn't even seen a microphone before. And it's a far more important interview with any politician. I can't be offended because nothing has happened. So the joy, right, is to bring a microphone to somebody who's never seen one before and get news from the place your audience has never been to. It is not about standing on a street corner at Westminster and shouting a question at a cabinet minister, because that gets no one anything.
Thank you. That's brilliant. What would you say to us about handling awkward interviewee situations? You must have had some challenging times where people have just not spoken, publicists have cut the interview. Is there any particular one interview, for example, that may stand out as being particularly challenging?
Well, I mean, I've had loads of people storm out of interviews. I was doing one in Zimbabwe, and a guy stormed out, and I realised it was his own office. So I was left sitting in his office. I was thinking, I'm not even sure how to handle this. I think that the key thing, really, fun enough, is on Radio 2 is interviews with listeners. Actually, I mean, that's the one where we do such a range of people. Today, if you were listening, we did a whole item on miscarriage. And I think, it was very moving. And what had happened actually was a singer-songwriter got in touch with me called Lucy May Walker, and she in lockdown she'd been asking her followers if they wanted songs written, and one of them had 2 miscarriages and 1 stillbirth. So she said to Lucy, "Can you write a song?" And that is not easy. And Lucy did it, and it is a beautiful song. And then she said, "Would you be able to do anything?" And I thought, well, actually, do you know what? If she came in and we played it and we got stories from the listeners, it would be an incredible item. And I just think in that moment where somebody's telling you that they carried a child inside them for 20, 30 weeks and then the child died, you cannot be in any other space. It is the most important thing. You've got to be right there with them. And the joy of radio is you can be. And we get, people today were ringing up and telling me things they hadn't told anybody else. I just find that's amazing. So in a way, I think the hardest interviews are with what I would call real people. We had the BBC, so-called BBC Pay scandal a while back, and all the presenters who were revealed to earn, whatever hundreds of thousands it was, all not came into work that day. And I thought, well, I've got to bloody go in and do my show. So I end up having to interview. I have to be careful what I say because I don't want to be quoted, but I end up having to interview the head of radio. And basically saying, his name was James Purnell, how can you pay somebody this much? And I'm talking about myself. How can you pay someone this much for basically reading out emails? It's the most bizarre interview I've ever done. And then the absolute coup de grace was that after that interview, a listener rings up. My name's Harry Neath from Wales. How do you justify the pay? So I took a complete and utter clobbering. And I thought that's exactly as it should be, because it's not my show. It belongs to the listeners. And if I'm in the news and they want to hit me for 6, they can do it. That's their right.
Jeremy, your face actually lights up when you talk about radio, which is lovely. I want to talk a bit about light entertainment. So from presenting Newsnight and working on Panorama through to Eggheads, what fun, and starring on Strictly Come Dancing, you've done a lot. What has been your favourite part of your career to date?
It's so funny. My brother's quite famous. My brother is a comedian called Tim Vine, and he's now been doing it for probably 30 years. And people always think, okay, so Jeremy's the serious one and Tim's the silly one. And actually, when we meet, we go to my mum's for lunch, our mum's for lunch, and we have a sister too, who's more talented than both of us. You'd think it was the other way around. So it looks like Tim does all the straight lines and I make all the jokes. And I think that probably I'm a comedian pretending to be serious and Tim is a serious person pretending to be a comedian. Or there's been some mix up. So the weird thing is this, right? All I want to do is be on the radio, as I described. I then thought, when I was at university, my mum said to me, listen, you don't want to play records for a living. You'll never do that the whole of your life. No one will employ you. You want to do something more serious. Normally, I wouldn't listen to my mum, but in this respect, I thought she was right. So I opted much more for journalism, Coventry Evening Telegraph, Today programme, Africa correspondent, political correspondent, Newsnight. So all getting more and more serious. And then bang, the bubble bursts and I end up sitting in for Jimmy Young on Radio 2. And then he goes, he's 83 years old. They give me his job. And at 42, I play Thunder Road by Bruce Springsteen. And I ring my mum and say, ha, you were wrong. Because I am now playing records for a living. And so I do have in me, although I, style as a serious person, I think I'm in my heart of hearts quite silly. And therefore, when someone said, the worst mistake I ever made broadcasting actually was from that, which was when someone said, we've got a brilliant graphic for you for the local elections. You're going to wear a cowboy hat and have a shootout with Nick Clegg. And of course I said, yeah, brilliant. And what about the actual trousers as well? And then it was massively clobbered. So I realized I have to restrain my silly side if I'm on the serious end of news, but Strictly did release it. And I think I'm a show off in the end. I don't know why, but Strictly was, I think your young students there sitting there, you'll blank this because this will sound incredibly ridiculous because all you do is have fun. But when you're 50 something, life is a bit straight. And then someone says you can go into a studio, dance with a beautiful person, male or female, wear lots of makeup and fancy clothes with sequins and have people scream at you and cheer you. It's like you're suddenly a child again. And it Strictly gives grown-ups the ability to be children for about 6 weeks, or I think it was 8 weeks in my case. And then when you come out of it, it's like such a crash. And I remember I was voted out in week 8. I had a dance off with the pop star Jamelia, which I was never going to win. And I was tempted, actually. I thought, I'm now going to lose here. Shall I fall over in the final? That would be brilliant, But I didn't. I actually made the mistake of trying to dance it properly. We failed. We were knocked out. The next day, the weather's like this, grey, horrible, wet, drizzly. And I'm cycling towards Radio 2. And classic, a black cab comes out the side road, nearly hits me. I catch up with the driver. I say, "Oi, didn't you see me there? This is my right way." He says, "You want to watch where you're going, mate?" So I thought, okay, I'm not going to win this one. I cycle off. And as I cycle off, I hear him shout after me, "And you're dancing shit as well." So I thought there's no end of the humiliation I'm prepared to go through,
Well, that leads nicely on to my next question, actually, which is about, the fact that everything hasn't always been glittering for you. And it leads me on to talk about social media and your helmet that you wear when you're cycling with the camera on. Funnily enough, that was my next question. So we do know, obviously, quite controversial. Oh, let's see the helmet with the camera.
Yeah,
show us.
Wait a second. Keep talking.
So we know that you post a lot of film footage on social media from anti-cyclists allegedly causing road rage on the streets. And, seriously, this has actually led to a conviction, I believe, in one instance. And also, when it comes to social media, I think it was a year ago, anti-vax campaigners showed up at your house.
Oh, God. Well, listen, I'm starting, there's quite a lot here because also I had a stalking case that was all digital, and that's quite interesting new territory. And the guy he's gone to prison now, but I think he terrorized a lot of people, and he was building up, I think, to be the sort of British Alex Jones, but a really kind of shit version of Alex Jones. But anyway, I do have, not off that topic, I have got, so this is it, okay? This is the camera. I know, isn't it amazing? I mean, it is proper, look, it's really big. And it's the Insta360 RS 1 inch. And what this, I mean, listen, again, I'm talking to 20-year-olds, so you know all this anyway, but this delivers a shot that looks like I've got a drone. So every time I upload anything, I get people saying, "You should not be flying a drone in central London." And and it's remarkable because it enables, because so basically the story is this, right? In my 40s, you've rightly pointed out that I am quite a hard worker, and I probably drive myself a bit too hard. And I just ended up in such a state. I got really burnt out. I had 2 young kids, and my, a brilliant wife who managed to look after them while I was running around, But in the end, I had it with life. I thought, this is awful. I just was not happy. So I thought the first thing I've got to do is I've got to get exercise. I joined a gym, and I went, the first year I went once and used the jacuzzi. So that I calculated I could have bought a jacuzzi for that. So I then thought, in that case, I'm going to have to embed exercise. So I start to cycle, and immediately I become not militant, but highly assertive about my safety. And I realized that basically there seemed to be a lot of drivers in London who only have one aim, which is to kill me while I'm on my bike. So I think, okay, I'm going to start filming everything. So a few years later, this thing comes on the market. This enables 360 vision of your cycle. Everything is, you can see the guy 100 yards back before I've seen him. He's on camera. And I had it just as an example. I had something the other day. I was cycling, and there's this guy to my right on the pavement just suddenly jumped, and there was a loud bang. And I had no idea what it was. And I looked, I couldn't see. I got home, I take this off, the film off, and I look. And what's happened is there's quite a high wind. There's a windowsill 5 floors up, and there's a plant pot on it that's rocking in the wind. And the wind takes it, drops it 5 floors. It explodes at this guy's feet. He thinks he's been shot or something. And then the crowd gathers to look at what it was. And I rebuild it all through my camera. So this is a great thing. It's nothing whatsoever to do with broadcasting, but it is a great thing. And social media has, oh my God, I was actually just, funny enough, I was just compiling a few social media things to just remind myself of how awful it can be. And it's pretty gruesome at the best of times. I'm wondering whether by the time all your students graduate, it just will have collapsed in on itself.
Well, obviously we don't know, do we? Certainly when it comes to Twitter, the future of that. But going back to social media and journalism, what is your relationship like with social media? Because you appear to so many people to actually love using it as a communications tool. And do you think for journalists it perhaps does more good than bad?
Well, look, I mean, I'm just looking up. I've kept a few troll tweets. Excuse the language, right? This is a tweet I got from someone called Right the Wrongs, and Right the Wrongs. Wrongs is spelled RONGS, and bad language is coming. Trigger warning. Okay, he says I've always read this in the same accent. I'd said something like, "Why am I being trolled today?" or something. He says, the only reason you get trolls is you are or act a brainless cunt, e.g. cycling down a road with temporary road signs, no motor vehicles, and you're asking if you can do that. You are just a knobhead who practice cronyism and nepotism. And nepotism is spelled NEPETISM. So when I see that, I think, I don't know why I'm doing this really. I mean, what is the point of engaging with that? It doesn't make any sense. But then again, another day I'll log on and I'll see a great story and I'll think, this is where it's all business is being done. I just want a troll filter, I don't know why. I get trolled a lot because people hate cyclists and people hate BBC presenters and people hate everybody, actually. I mean, it's and I apologize for the language, but it's not my language. So what can I say? We all know it's there.
And it is there, and it's there 24/7, isn't it? So how do you switch off? Are you sociable when you go home from a week at work? Or do you just retreat and turn every technical device?
How do I switch off? I've got 2 teenage daughters, right? So that's my life. I love, one of the things that's incredible is that the BBC is so random, and a lot of the times it will treat people very badly by accident, but sometimes it treats people very well by accident. And the thing it did accidentally to me was to put me on a radio station without realizing that I love music. So a lot of the stuff that's happened that's been incredibly special for me has been music related. Now, to give you an example, every day in the morning, the first thing I do at Radio 2, I talk to my editor what we're doing. I cycle over here at 11 o'clock, and then I have to go up and speak to Ken Bruce at 11:30. Now, if you're not aware of British radio, Ken is undoubtedly one of the top 5 music radio voices of all time in this country since the invention of the microphone. He's brilliant. He's in the league of Chris Evans and Steve Wright and Kenny Everett and John Peel and all that. So I come and talk to him, and pre-COVID, he would occasionally have musicians in and interview them. and he had Gladys Knight in. Now, Gladys Knight did Midnight Train to Georgia, right? And he puts on Midnight Train to Georgia while she's sitting beside me. And I say, and I know every word. So the first opening line is LA proved too much for the guy. And I start singing, and she starts singing with me. And I'm thinking, I'm singing Midnight Train to Georgia with Gladys Knight sitting beside me. My work on earth is done. There is nothing else necessary now. So a lot of my thrills are non-journalistic, I must say, and I love music. I went to see the Proclaimers the other night. I thought the first time I saw them was in a pub in Coventry. I do think in life you do need passions. If you don't have any passions, you may be dead inside. That's my worry.
So it just highlights the importance, doesn't it, mental health wise, that we all need to switch off from what we do and what we love day in, day out. With so much focus in journalism about looking after mental health now, isn't there?
Yeah, I'm a little bit confused by that, because obviously I don't think we could be any less mentally well than we were 30, 40 years ago. I think in the end it was people just held their pain forever without showing it. And then when it came out, they were basically psychotic or deranged, and they were put in an asylum. I mean, quite literally, that's what happened in the 70s. Now people express their difficulties much earlier. It doesn't mean there's more pain. It just means there's a lower threshold for being aware of other people's pain. But I do think I would say that, and recently I had to do a talk, and someone said, can you come and talk about mental health? And my initial reaction is, well, what do I know about that? And then I had to fess up and say actually quite a lot. So I went and did this off the record talk in a bank actually in the city, and I went through the whole thing. And to me, the thing is this, that some of us would tend to get depressed in stressful situations. The most common cause of major league depression is work-related stress. And if you don't get depressed, that's not necessarily a good thing, because I've got a close colleague here who I don't think gets depressed. He just works and works and works. And then one day he has a terrible stroke and he now can't use his left arm. So I think depression is a safety mechanism, but it's very inaccurate and untidy. And so it will, if your body decides it's had enough, it'll put you to bed for a year. And that's inconvenient. So I think that you really want to avoid that if possible. But at the moment, I'm not suggesting you avoid burnout. I'm suggesting that you work your socks off. Let's be clear. Avoiding burnout is not what you do in your 20s. In your 20s, you have to work as hard as you possibly can, because you won't beat the next person on talent. You'll beat them on work rate. Talent, we'll find out later about talent. For now, all we have is work rate. So I'm sorry, I'm off message here. If you can't, we have people in work experience, and I can tell it's so interesting when people come into the studio, either Radio 2 or actually Channel 5 a lot, and someone says, can you bring Jeremy a cup of tea or coffee? I mean, listen, I don't need anyone to bring me tea or coffee, but they'll say to me, what do you want? And I'll say, oh, a tea would be good. And they'll bring me a coffee. And I know it doesn't matter, but I just know it's not gonna happen for them. And I just think, do the really small things well, and take a lot of pride in the smallest job. When you just your first foot in the door, do really small stuff really well. We had somebody on Channel 5 called Darcy, who was very quiet. I would almost say mousy, said very little, but she worked assisting with graphics, and we began to take the graphics to a bit of a different level, and it involved a lot of craft work and cardboard and glue and paper, and she nailed it. And she, after about a year, she was completely indispensable. And Darcy is the model for work experience. So I don't know whether Darcy was trying to avoid burnout, but I suspect not.
Oh, I love these life lessons with you. I wanted to touch on something. You've just talked about people in pain on a much more serious note. And it would be wrong of me, because I look after public affairs here at Leeds Trinity University as well. We always talk about holding people in power to account, which is so important in journalism. Now, you recently spoke out, didn't you, against emergency services, publicly apologising after the reports, highlighting their response to the Manchester Arena bombing. So how important do you believe it is for journalists to continue holding people in power to account? And do we actually succeed in doing that in journalism?
So much there. Well, firstly, on the Manchester bombing, I mean, what happened was a discussion in the studio, so I wasn't really speaking out. I was asking a question of somebody else, but I think we all felt, looking at the report, you know, they had one job, and you know, I'm sure there were great people there, but my God, they absolutely failed. The idea that you've got people who've been blown up and need urgent help, they can hear sirens, but they don't see any emergency workers, and then they die. It's just terrible. But leaving that, I mean, yeah, absolutely. Because look, I mean, the biggest single story in politics, I suppose in the last 10 years, the one I feel that was the defining story was the MP's expenses scandal, right? And what happened there was that they had been claiming unbelievable wedges, and even to a point of criminality, because some of them went to jail. And I don't know if you know how this happened, but basically they brought in some people as not work experience, but as temps to try and do some of the paperwork. And one of them was ex-army, and he was looking at stuff. You know, a guy claimed for cleaning up a helicopter landing pad. Someone claimed to clear his moat. The famous claim for a duck house. A guy claimed for 3 matching lampshades, etc., etc. And the balloon went up, and it was a great example of how, if you give people the ability to be corrupt, they will be corrupt. And they need, as somebody once said, Baggio, daylight is the best disinfectant. So once the curtains were open, it was very painful for the politicians. Some of them never really recovered. Some of them lost their jobs forever. But that was a classic example. It was the Telegraph that did it. They bought the file. They put in a shadow team of people to go through every single claim. They even put a book out. I mean, that was the most phenomenal work of journalism that I've seen in the last 20 years. It was incredible. So that's what we're here for, really. You know, but I think that the thing has changed is that the journalists are now surveyed as well. We're now under the microscope. So we have to be aware of that too. You know, people are no longer saying, you know, it doesn't matter who's asking the questions. They're quite interested. Who's that asking the questions? How much is he paid? What's he got to? Is he a Tory? Is he Labour? What's going on? So we have to be prepared for that scrutiny as well. And that's, I think, quite uncomfortable, actually, because previously we were just a pack of people who shouted questions. We had at the BBC, when I was at Westminster in the 90s, we had a woman called Joy Johnson, and she was known as the chief shouter. And her one job was to stand outside Number 10 and shout, "Are you going to resign?" Now, people would say, "Who's that woman? What's her name? What's she doing? Who does she married to? Where does she live?" It's different. So we're all much more accountable, and maybe that's a good thing.
And obviously, you've got to be thick-skinned working within industry and journalism. Can you remember the first time in the earlier parts of your career where you had to sort of really become thick-skinned? Is that something you learned to do very quickly?
Yeah, well, it's always comes when you get told off by the boss. I mean, what happened to me? I turned up a number of things. I mean, I was on the Today program. I was so out of my depth, and I turned up, and they said, "We want you to go to Sarajevo because there's some sort of war starting in Yugoslavia." I thought it would be like 3 days. Turned out it was going to be 6 years. And I said, "I'll have to go via home. I haven't got my passport." And they were really angry that I hadn't brought my passport in. And I thought, God, no one's even told me I should have my passport, but maybe I should have realised that. And then my colleague Justin Webb was at the airport as well. He said he's had a nightmare because the cameraman turned up, met him at TV Centre, and Justin said to the cameraman, "Right, we're going to Belgrade." And the cameraman said, "Belgrade? I thought they said Belgrave Square." So it was a funny old day. But I think the key thing is being told off by your boss, actually. And I had so many bollockings in the early days. And I'm quite glad for them. But I think these days people are much more careful how they speak to the more junior members, and they wouldn't do it now. But I did sort of have to learn really quickly, and getting told off for stuff that wasn't your fault and having to accept it, I found particularly difficult. But yeah, as to being shouted at by interviewees or having people complain, as a classic is interviewees complain about the piece you've done. That happens all the time. I suppose it's all very well being flame proof or bomb proof, but actually being quite sensitive is good, because you want to work, they might be right. They might be right. And you want to be receptive to that. You really want to be the person who says, "Okay, let me try and learn from this. I'll take my personal feelings out of it, but you're saying I've done a bad job today. Let me just try and work out why." So I always tried to soak it up, but maybe I should have argued back.
Well, I think it stood you in good stead even. So I've just caught eye of the time actually. So I'd like to open up for any questions that we have amongst our audience. I think we've got quite a few questions, Jeremy, so we'll go as quickly as we can. I think we're going to start
Brilliant.
at the back.
Hi, Jeremy. I just wanted to ask about confidence and situations where you're not entirely sure what to do. You seem quite calm during most situations, whereas someone like me might falter. How do you kind of overcome those challenges?
That is such a great question. As I mentioned, I'm 57. When I got to about 50, I thought think long and hard about what your generation calls checking your privilege. And of course, people always think you think you've got there because you're good or whatever, or you worked hard. I mean, I've indicated that I think it's, in my case, it's much more work than talent, more perspiration than inspiration. But I had to really look and think. When I walked into the BBC in 1987, I'm a 6'3" white male who's been to private school, and in those days they probably just thought, okay, we'll take him, he doesn't even need to speak, it's fine. That's because back in the day, and the thing that gives you, that gave me, probably with that level of privilege, was firstly total misunderstanding that I thought I got there because I was good. I think I actually just got there because I fulfilled their idea of what's good, which is very different. And secondly, almost front-loading confidence. And I think that, and I don't, I see it in my kids a bit, who again, I suppose I don't know whether we spoiled them or given them private school or whatever, I don't know. But I just think there's a blagging that goes on with some people, which is stunning. And it's particularly the case with blokes. Now, if you're not a blagger, there's two alternatives. You can learn to blag, which means you just hold it in and walk into the room and just be that person. Or you can sort of, as you've done today, you can front load your hesitancy. And I think that's rather beautiful, actually. Because I think a lot of the people who get things really badly wrong are, they're the blaggers. I mean, to give you an example, right? This is such a classic thing. I got a Brompton bike. It's the folding bike. And they gave it to me on trial and they didn't tell me how to unfold it. And it should be obvious. And for 15 minutes, I wrestle with it. And then I go out of the house and there's two people sitting on a wall opposite. A woman, middle-aged woman, and her younger son. And I say, can either of you unfold a Brompton? And the woman says, no, never done that. And the bloke says, yes. And he comes in, he spends 15 minutes, like I have, just wrestling with it on the floor like it's a crocodile. And in the end, I said, you've never done this before, have you? He said, no, but I thought I could do it. And I'm thinking, I don't really like that quality of blagging. So listen, I would say, don't worry about your hesitancy. It's a very attractive characteristic.
Thank you. Next question.
I've got two questions, if I may, both with a Leeds connection. The first is, what can you tell us about Richie Anderson, because he's a Leeds Trinity alumni? And the second is, how was it trying to cover the Jimmy Savile allegations when they were first coming to light?
God, you ranged through there, haven't you? From hero to villain. I mean, I actually just saw Richie earlier. So he was on Strictly, lovely guy, does the travel for Ken. Yeah, sweet guy. I don't know him that well, but he's a lovely broadcaster with a sort of such a winning personality. And I say, if you want to broadcast and you want to be on the air, I hope you do. Radio is quite a good place to listen and to work out who communicates a personality through only their voice, right? And Richie's a good example of somebody who does. Sadly, Jimmy Savile did as well. And Jimmy Savile pretty much left the day I joined in 1987, so I can't claim to have overlapped with him at all. I know he's Leeds based. I mean, I know that's the whole connection. I don't know what I can add except, I watched the Louis Theroux documentary where he said, a lot of people think you're a paedophile, and Jimmy Savile said, no, I'm not. And at the time, to my shame, I thought the question was out of order because I thought there's lots of rumors, but there's no more than that. Now, Louis Theroux says, well, he should have given him what for about these rumors because they all turn out to be true. But it's really difficult, isn't it? It's really difficult when you have a complete situation where the whole thing is masked. And what's really interesting is the way that we didn't listen to the people who didn't have a voice, and they were picked off by him. And I guess we just need to learn from that. I mean, that's the crucial thing. But the funny thing about it is we then swing back the other way. So we then go into a situation where we say victims will be believed. When they come to the police, they'll be believed. And as soon as the police say that, and you just only take a second to think about how foolish it is to say that, we then have the whole process is subverted by a guy called Carl Beach, who turns out to be an Olympic level hoaxer, who gives them stories about Lord Bramall and I don't know whether it was Gambo or all kinds of people who were Cliff Richard, completely innocent, who he manages to convince the police needed investigating. So the only answer I can give you is you shouldn't swing to any extreme when you're dealing with this stuff. And it may be that Savile, like Harold Shipman, was a once in a century event, and it's quite difficult to legislate for that.
Thank you. Next question.
Thank you for being here today. Just before I ask my question, I've known of your work for many years, and my parents always pick up on a funny comment my dad goes around saying this: cats in gangs, and I know as well you were a massive David Bowie fan. And one story I remember of yours very, very well was a couple of years ago when I think we're driving home, and there was a story about somebody who'd gone on the motorway and they were speeding at ridiculous speeds, and some of the callers that came in, it's just one of them that I remember very well. But the question is, how do you deal, or how do you know or deal with people who are fake callers who are not really real people? Because recently I've come across an interview from it came from a Twitter account that both believed to be real in sports journalism, and actually they've gone on to then do an interview, and I've clocked that interview and I've said, this ain't really real. It's somebody putting on an accent, being fake. Or how do you deal with them types of people when if you think it's fake, or kind of if it is a fake interview and you find out it is fake in the end?
Great question. Cats in gangs was I'd said, we have a situation where there are cats operating in Portsmouth, possibly in gangs. And Sean Kingsley then turned it into a whole thing. So I'm quite proud of that. I love that your parents listened. The motorway story I can't remember, but there was the biggest response we ever had was a policeman who said he needed to test drive a car at 140 on a motorway, and he was not charged, and the listeners went absolutely ballistic about it. But yeah, hoaxers. We haven't had, touch wood, that many on. I don't think on Radio 2. We did have. If you've got a moment, I'll tell you a story about a hoaxer though. We had a guy who rang up and he conned us completely. He was brilliant. He was the Salvador Dali of hoaxers. He said that he was a guy who'd gone into a pub once and stolen a coat, and he described it in great detail what sort of coat it was, and he said he took it home. He never looked at the wallet, he never looked at the contents, but he hung it up, and he said, I've now got 85 coats and they're in a lockup, and I want to start returning them, and I need your advice. And it was so beguiling, this story. We fell for it. It's about 10-15 years ago, but we didn't realize it was untrue for a long time. And we had another call from somebody who said that their house was about to collapse because of a infestation of bats, but they'd been told they couldn't deal with it because it would be cruel. So he's just waiting for the day his house collapsed. And then the third one we had was this guy who said that he got evidence of how people cheat on benefits. He was looking after a man who was deaf, blind, doubly incontinent, wheelchair bound, used a wheelchair and couldn't basically move anything except one eyelid. And then he gave up that job. He went to Spain. He was on holiday and he was on the beach in Spain, and someone came surfing towards him on the beach, and it was the same person, right? So it was evidence of benefit fraud. And we thought, when we got that call, we thought, that's not right. That's too good a story. And the number was the same number as the bat guy and the coat guy. So we've been done this 3 times by one person who was absolutely brilliant because he understood what we wanted, and we then took to take some action to make sure he never called us again, which he didn't. But I think you're always going to be. I mean, one of our failings as journalists now, we're so experience driven. So if you see the film Schindler's List, you'll know the great power of that film is the moment when you see the girl in the red coat. And if you haven't seen it, I won't explain further, but we operate like that. We are looking for the girl in the red coat to try and make everything clear. And the trouble is that leaves you a little bit vulnerable. So there was this, gosh, you've got me on hoaxes, which is so interesting because it is a kind of fascination of mine. There was a story that went around everywhere. It wasn't just us. I mean, actually, we barely covered it, but it was a guy in the West Midlands, a farmer, who was exporting scaffolds for hanging in other countries. And he got an export license and it went crazy. He was posing next to his scaffold. He said he had a multiple scaffold they used in Zimbabwe. They put it on a flatbed truck and they could then hang 4 people and move on to the next village and hang another 4. And there was political stuff. The prime minister got involved. Turns out he was just an ordinary guy who wanted to hoax everyone. And he just built a scaffold. And he said this, and it went before, as somebody once said, but you know, a lie is going around the world before the truth has got its shoes on. And so we're cautious. If it's too good a story, we need to wonder if it's not true. There we are. But it happens very rarely, I must say. The problem we've had on Channel 5 is bad language, actually. We've had, interestingly, we had a guy who used to keep shouting the C word at Matthew Wright. He then stopped when I took over, and then he started again with me. Nobody paid a blind bit of attention. Then I was on holiday, and Diamond sat in for me, and he shouted it at her, and the whole ceiling fell in. I mean, Ofcom were involved in everything, so there's a little bit of sexism in action there.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Next question. I think I'm just aware of the time, so I don't want to keep you too long, Jeremy. Thank you.
Hi, Jeremy. I've got 2 interlinking ones, if possible. Essentially, what's your hardest hitting story you've ever had to cover, and how did you deal with that?
Oh, I can tell you actually. I mean, and I was very proud of this. I was trying to work out how to do something on Radio 2 that was a documentary but had a music-based thing. And I had this idea that we should do a series called The Songs My Son Loved, in which mums who'd lost it was sons because it's predominantly men who die in Afghanistan and Iraq, mums who'd lost their sons in the war in Afghanistan or Iraq remembered them through the music they loved. And the reason it was interesting is because you, as the mum, you probably hate all the music. But the thing is, once your son dies, you love it all. So I went to their homes. We recorded it with them. It was overwhelming. And I kept in touch with some of them, and they gave us a portrait of their son the day they discovered they lost him. You know, they took me to show his bedroom, his drum kit, his CD collection, whatever. And then they played the music, and it was just mind-blowing.
Thank you. Next question. We've got one just on the other end. Getting the steps in today, aren't we?
Well done.
Thanks. You mentioned scrutiny on journalists increasing recently. Do you think that's a way for people you're interviewing, for instance MPs, to wrestle back the narrative and take some control and power?
Journalists it's a weird thing. When in the 90s, I was political correspondent, right? It's funny, I barely mentioned that job. I can't tell you how much fun it was. It was like, because I love politics, it was like walking into a movie. Because to me, I know they say politics is show business for ugly people, but for me, it was like, this is incredible, you know. And there was a scandal called Cash for Questions, which caught 2 MPs, one called David Tredinnick and the other one called Graham Riddick. And Graham Riddick was quite a nice guy who I'd met quite a lot. And one day I walked into a House of Commons lift and he walked in as well. And he was going to have to resign his seat. It was a shocking situation. And he said, you know what? He said, you lot, you're like a herd of very thick bison. And we all stand at a distance and we point at you and we laugh. And then when you charge, it's all over. And I thought it's quite a good way of describing the press pack. So I don't think individually we amount to much. I mean, there'll be journalists who, you know, come a cropper in one way or another. And crucially, we do just spend a lot of time grazing. But when we charge, it's over. That's the thing. Look at the Truss government. I mean, for you guys, it's really weird because you're used to prime ministers changing like managers of Chelsea Football Club. But bear in mind, I was 14 when Thatcher came to power. I was 25 when she left power. I was then 32 when Blair came in, and when he left power, I was in my mid-40s. So we were used to real stability there. And this is nuts. And I think it's because the sort of media surge now is so powerful. The Bison surge is almost unstoppable. It really, really is. Look at Gavin Williamson now. He's got, what has he got, a day, 2 days left?
This leads me on to my final question from us all here. Jeremy, if you were Prime Minister, what would you change?
Do you know what? I've started, I thought I'd try and write a book called When I Am King, which would be about all the stuff that was going to change. I couldn't think of anything. I mean, I'd change really small things. I mean, people who can't drive would all have to ride bikes for a start. I wouldn't have any signs on cliffs saying warning cliff, because like a cliff carries its own warning. The fact is, I sort of feel we've got real problems with our democracy, seriously, because if you're in Wales, let's say, you've got, and let's go back to when we were in the EU, you would have a parish councillor, a county councillor, an MP at Westminster, an assembly member in Cardiff. You then had also an MEP in Brussels, and you could argue the Americans were running a one world government. So you're represented by about 6 people. This is quite onerous. We've got 860 members of the House of Lords. What are they doing in there? I'm not saying Scotland shouldn't have its own parliament and Wales shouldn't have its own. But when you've got 3 or 4 separate approaches to a virus, as we had during the pandemic, in an island that's half the size of France, it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. And I think, but there's no way around it. We in the end, when you go for democracy, you can go for more and more and more of it. Now, classic example is this, right? I'll give you this as an example. When I cycle, I go from Chiswick in West London to right here where I am now, Oxford Circus, Portland Place. There's a cycle path that's starting to be built, right? And it's brilliant. It means I'm less likely to die. However, there's a 1.5 mile break in Kensington. Why is that? Because people have said decisions need to be made locally, right? The key to democracy is local people decide. Well, great. So these clowns in Kensington with their tweed jackets and their pipes don't like cyclists. So they're stopping a cycle lane. This is like people in Nottingham, or Leeds for that matter, saying we're going to close the M1 because we don't like it. And, we need to think about what kind of democracy we want. This is for you guys. It's coming your way. What are we doing about climate change? Have we got a democracy that's able to decide as a nation what we do about climate change? Because if the world is on fire, it's pretty bloody urgent. We were told by Boris Johnson he's going to build 4 nuclear reactors and 44 new hospitals. Actually, last time I looked, he was on holiday again. So we were told we're going to get a 3rd runway at Heathrow in 1957. They still haven't got planning permission. So I don't know how I change it, but that, I guess, that's why I'm a journalist. I don't know. I only have questions. They say, I'm not meaning to go on, but they say that there's 100 people in a room and a fire breaks out. 98 people start panicking. 1 person stands on a table and tells them all what to do. That's the politician. And the last person, the 100th person, stands at the back of the room and shouts abuse at the person on the table. That's the journalist. So there we are.
Oh, Jeremy Vine, we could talk for hours. Thank you so much. Please give a round of applause for Jeremy Vine. Thank you. Lots of love. Come and see us sometime soon. Thank you. Bye. Love you. Bye-bye.